This documentary is based on historical research, academic sources, and declassified archives. It presents the Cold War from a structural and geopolitical perspective. When people hear the term Cold War, they often imagine a simple story: freedom versus oppression, capitalism versus communism, the United States versus the Soviet Union. But history is rarely that simple. For nearly half a century, the world lived under the shadow of two superpowers. Most Western narratives describe the Cold War as a struggle against expansionist Soviet ideology. But what did the conflict look like from Moscow? To understand that, we must step back to 1945. The war that shaped Soviet thinking. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II victorious, but devastated. More than 20 million Soviet citizens had died. Entire cities were destroyed. Large parts of the country were in ruins. Unlike the United States, the Soviet Union did not fight the war across oceans. It was fought on its soil. In Soviet memory, invasion was not theoretical. It was recent, catastrophic, and existential. So when the war ended, security became the central priority of Soviet leadership. Not expansion for prestige, not ideology alone. Security, buffer zones, defense, or expansion. After 1945, the Soviet Union established influence over Eastern Europe. Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia became part of a Soviet-aligned bloc. In Western eyes, this was imperial expansion. In Soviet strategic thinking, it was a buffer zone. Historically, Russia had been invaded from the West multiple times. Napoleon in 1812, Germany in World War I. The Soviet leadership believed that friendly or controlled neighboring states were necessary to prevent another invasion. Was this morally simple? No, but it was strategically consistent with centuries of Russian security concerns. In 1945, the United States used atomic weapons in Japan. The US possessed a weapon capable of destroying entire cities instantly. For several years, the Soviet Union had no equivalent. From Moscow's perspective, this imbalance created vulnerability. The Soviet nuclear program accelerated not simply as an ideological competition, but as a survival necessity. The arms race had begun. NATO and encirclement. In 1949, the United States and Western European countries formed NATO. The alliance was designed as a collective defense organization. But from the Soviet viewpoint, NATO looked like military encirclement, an alliance of capitalist powers, led by Washington, positioned near Soviet borders. In response, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Each side saw its actions as defensive. Each side saw the other as aggressive. This is the security dilemma in action. When defensive measures by one side are perceived as threats by the other, ideology and control of the Cold War was not only military, it was ideological. The Soviet system promoted centralized planning, state ownership, and one-party governance. Western countries promoted market economies and political pluralism. Each system believed it represented a superior model for humanity. Inside the Soviet Union, stability and unity were prioritized over political competition. Dissent was often interpreted as destabilization, especially during external confrontation. To Western observers, this looked like repression. To Soviet authorities, it looked like internal security management during global hostility. The difference lies in perspective. Crisis points fear on both sides. Consider the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Western narratives emphasized Soviet missiles placed in Cuba, but Soviet leadership viewed this move partly as a response to US missiles stationed in Turkey, near Soviet borders. Both sides felt threatened. Both sides believed they were reacting. The world came close to nuclear war, not because one side wanted destruction, but because mutual suspicion escalated beyond control. The Cold War was built on fear, not constant aggression. The space race competition extended beyond weapons. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 shocked the West. From the Soviet perspective, technological achievement demonstrated resilience and global relevance. It was proof that the Soviet model could compete with industrial capitalism. Space became symbolic, not only of science, but of legitimacy. The economic strain by the 1970s and 1980s, systemic weaknesses became more visible. Centralized planning struggled with efficiency. Innovation slowed. Consumer goods were limited compared to Western economies. Military spending remained high. The Soviet leadership faced a difficult equation: maintain superpower status or reform internally. Reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev, Perestroika, and Glasnost aimed to modernize the system. Instead, they accelerated fragmentation, collapse. Internal more than external. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, many in the West declared victory. But from within, the collapse was more complex. Economic stagnation, bureaucratic rigidity, declining public trust, and national independence movements all played roles. External pressure mattered. Internal structural weaknesses mattered more. The Soviet system did not collapse overnight because of a single speech or policy. It eroded gradually under the weight of contradiction between centralized control and modern complexity. What the West often missed from the Soviet perspective: the Cold War was not simply a mission to dominate the world. It was a struggle for security after catastrophic invasions, strategic parity in a nuclear age, ideological legitimacy, global recognition as a superpower. This does not excuse repression. It does not romanticize authoritarian governance. But understanding requires context. History becomes dangerous when simplified into heroes and villains. The Cold War was a prolonged standoff driven by fear, pride, trauma, and miscalculation on both sides. The bigger lesson: the Cold War teaches a structural lesson. When two powers operate under mutual suspicion, every defensive move looks offensive. Systems respond to perceived threats. Leaders act within historical memory. And narratives differ depending on which side of the border you stand. Understanding the Soviet perspective does not require agreement.